In the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, where the blue haze of the Appalachian Mountains lingers like a quiet ghost and time seems slower than anywhere else, there existed a community untouched by the outside world. Some called it forgotten, others called it forsaken. But to the families that had lived there for generations, it was simply home, a place where survival meant more than comfort, and traditions often passed down without question. One of the oldest families in this region was the Ballards, a name known only by a handful of people outside their remote holler. Their cabin stood crooked on a wooded hill, unreachable by car, with a rusted tin roof and broken windows long replaced by heavy quilts. The Ballards hadn't left the mountains in decades. They farmed their own food, hunted their own meat, and educated their children through whispered stories, not textbooks. This was how it had always been. But buried beneath the surface of that life, deeper than the coal veins that ran under the hills, was a secret. One that would shatter not only the Ballard family, but the myth that ignorance was ever harmless. At the center of that legacy was a man named Luther Wayne Ballard. He was born in 1943, during a time when the war raged far away, and the government rarely visited the mountains. His father, a harsh man hardened by work and whiskey, taught him early on that outsiders don't belong in these hills. Luther grew up isolated, not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. He was never taught right from wrong in the way most children are. He was taught how to keep things hidden and how to protect what's yours no matter the cost. When Luther was just 17, tragedy struck. His mother died, and his younger sister, Cora, barely 14, became his only family. With no one to guide them, no teachers, no church leaders, and no moral compass, Luther's twisted understanding of loyalty and love took root. Over time, his relationship with Cora turned from protective to possessive, and eventually into something unnatural, something wrong. But in the silence of the mountains, there was no one to stop it. No neighbors came knocking, no authorities ever came asking questions. It was just the two of them living in their own world. And when Cora gave birth to her first son, Micah, the only witness was the wind rustling through the pine trees. To those outside this reality, it's unthinkable, but to Luther and Cora, it became normalized. By the time they had 3 sons together, the line between right and wrong had been completely erased. The boys were raised without birth certificates, without schooling, without outside contact. Their entire world was their father and their mother, who also happened to be their aunt. This was the hidden legacy not just of inbreeding, but of trauma. A legacy not born from evil, but from generations of ignorance, fear, and survivalism. It wasn't a cult, it wasn't a crime ring, it was something much more terrifying, a quiet tragedy passed down like a family recipe no one dared question. But what made this story different from the countless others buried in the hills of Appalachia was this: it didn't stay hidden forever. Micah, the eldest, would grow up with questions his father couldn't answer and his mother feared, questions that cracked open the walls of the legacy his family tried so hard to protect. He began to wonder why they had no visitors, why they couldn't go to town, why his parents flinched at the mention of God or government, why his younger brothers looked just like him, not just as siblings do, but eerily identical, like reflections from the same broken mirror. The truth didn't come all at once. It came in pieces like fragments of glass that cut deeper the more he tried to see clearly. But once Micah discovered what had happened, once he realized the twisted roots of his family tree, he didn't collapse under the weight of shame. He decided to become the break in the pattern, the crack in the generational curse, the first Ballard to say no more. But before change could happen, the truth had to be told. And that truth started here in the forgotten mountains of Appalachia, where a family's darkest legacy had been buried for decades under silence, secrecy, and shame. What rose from those hills wasn't just a tragic tale. It was a lesson, one that proves that even in the deepest darkness, a single spark of awareness can lead to a fire that burns generations of pain. Micah, Eli, and Amos Ballard were the sons of Luther and Cora's sons, born into a world so far removed from society that even the word normal meant nothing to them. Their lives were confined to a single mountain slope in rural Appalachia. They had never seen a school bus, never used a phone, never even walked on concrete. Their shoes were made of stitched cloth and old tires. Their meals came from whatever grew from the earth or fell by their father's rifle. And for years they thought this was all there was. But children grow, and with growth comes curiosity, a dangerous gift when you live inside a lie. Micah, the oldest, was always the quiet observer. While his brothers hunted or wrestled near the creek, he often sat on the porch, eyes squinting at the trees beyond their land. He'd ask questions no one wanted to answer. Why don't we go into town? Why don't we have birthdays? Why do people say we're special? Luther, their father, would silence him with glares. Cora, their mother, would cry at night behind the cabin when she thought no one was listening. But Micah listened. He always did. By the time he was 13, Micah started to notice something else. The way his father always watched their every move, the way Cora avoided mirrors, the way the family Bible had pages torn out. And most of all, the strange tension in the air, a silence not of peace, but of fear. Then came a moment that cracked the illusion forever. It was a Sunday morning like any other, when Micah found an old National Geographic magazine under the cabin's floorboards. Water, stained, dated years before he was born, but it held something priceless. Pictures, real ones, cities, cars, children playing in parks, schools filled with books and chalkboards, and people who didn't look like their family. Clean faces, laughter, eyes that weren't haunted. He sat on the porch that day with Illy and Amos, flipping through every torn page. "What is this place?" Illy asked, pointing at a picture of a classroom. "I think it's school," Micah answered softly. Amos stared at a photo of a city street and said, "Is that real?" It was a simple question, but it cracked the silence like thunder, because that was the day they began to understand something was wrong. The more Micah read, the more he realized that their life wasn't just different, it was cut off. And once that seed of awareness took root, everything changed. He started sneaking out at night, walking beyond the ridge, trying to see if there were others like them. One night, he spotted a flickering light far off in the valley in what looked like a house with electricity. It was miles away, but it was real. That was when he knew there was a world beyond this. And maybe, just maybe, he could belong in it. He brought his brothers back to that same hilltop weeks later. They sat under the stars, watching the distant town shimmer with lights. "Why don't we live there?" Amos asked. "Because we were never meant to," Micah answered, "but that doesn't mean we can't." This was the beginning of their awakening, the realization that their normal wasn't normal at all. For most children, questions about identity are part of growing up. But for Micah, Illy, and Amos, those questions came with pain. They were born into a lie, shaped by generations of secrecy and shame. Their parents hadn't just lied to them, they'd trapped them in a world built on trauma. And yet, the miracle was this: they didn't accept it. They didn't continue the cycle, they questioned it. Their journey toward the truth became their greatest act of courage. Micah, barely 15, would one day lead his brothers down the mountain and into the county sheriff's office, barefoot and trembling but determined. He didn't know what the world would think of them. He didn't know if they'd be taken away, punished, or helped. But he knew one thing: "This is not normal," he said, "and I want to know what is." That moment, that choice to seek truth, became the beginning of freedom. The story of these three brothers isn't just a tragedy. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the idea that no matter how you're born, no matter what darkness surrounds you, you have the right to ask questions. You have the right to choose another path. You have the right to say, "This ends with me." Micah had always felt like something was off, like the silence in their home wasn't peace, it was hiding something. But it wasn't until the day he saw his mother break down in front of an old, rusted mirror that the weight of truth finally crashed into his young heart. She had been cleaning, just another ordinary day in their secluded Appalachian cabin. Dust swirled in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the wooden slats. Her hair was tied back, her face tired and worn not from age, but from the kind of sorrow that eats away at a person from the inside. Micah had just entered the room when she froze in front of the mirror. She looked at herself for a long time, then whispered, barely audible, "I should have said no." Micah stood in silence. He wanted to ask her what she meant. But before he could, she crumbled to the floor, sobbing. That was the moment. Not a scream, not a revelation, not a confrontation. Just the sound of a mother breaking under the weight of a secret too heavy to carry anymore. And suddenly the pieces came together, the looks, the whispers, the anger in their father's voice whenever someone mentioned outsiders, the stories that were never told, the lack of pictures, the torn pages of the family Bible. The way their father said, "The world out there will never understand us." Micah understood now. Cora, the woman he called Mama, was also Luther's sister, and he, along with Illy and Amos, was the result of that twisted union. The truth hit him like a landslide. Micah didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't even run. He just stood there, still as stone, and felt the lie unravel inside him. That was his moment of awakening. Everything changed. For years, Micah had accepted his world because it was all he knew. But in that instant, the veil lifted. He could no longer pretend that what they were living was normal. He could no longer justify the isolation, the control, the shame. It wasn't just about where they lived or how they lived, it was about who they were forced to be. That night, he stared at the ceiling of the old cabin and whispered a promise to himself. "I will not become like him." For days, Micah was silent, watching, thinking. Every movement his father made now felt more like a threat than a gesture. Every word seemed like a trap, but Micah didn't flinch. He became sharper, quieter, more aware. He started speaking to his brothers in code, especially to Illy, who was sensitive and smart. Micah knew they needed a plan, not just to leave the mountain, but to find their own truth, their own identity, away from the shadow of Luther's sin. He began asking Cora questions when Luther wasn't around. "Did you ever want to leave?" She looked at him with eyes soaked in regret. "Every day." "Then why didn't you?" Her voice cracked. "Because I was already broken before I had the chance." Those words stung, not because of the pain in them, but because Micah recognized something terrifying. If he didn't act now, he too could become broken before he had the chance. It was a quiet revolution. Not with torches, not with rage, but with awareness, with a question, with a decision. This is wrong. That's how real awakenings happen, not always in fire, but in the stillness of a moment when a soul decides enough. Micah began to imagine a world beyond the mountain. He didn't know what school was like, or what cities looked like up close, but he knew they existed. He had seen flickers of them in old books and magazines. He had even heard the crackling voice of a radio one time at a neighbor's farm when Luther took him to trade. That tiny taste of a different world had once confused him. Now it fueled him. He knew escape wouldn't be easy. But he also knew something greater. Staying would destroy them. This wasn't just about leaving a place. It was about escaping a legacy, a curse, a lie wrapped in silence, sealed with fear. Micah understood that his father was not just a man, he was a prison. And the only key out was truth. This awakening wasn't just his alone, it became contagious. Illy began asking questions too. Amos followed. The bonds of silence started to crack. The fear began to loosen its grip. They didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time they saw it clearly. And the first step was this: we are not who he says we are. Micah stood at the edge of the forest, wind rushing past his face like a warning and a promise. Behind him lay the only world he'd ever known, the cabin, the mountains, the twisted silence, and the family secret that had shackled his soul since the moment he understood what truth was. Ahead of him, the unknown, but anything was better than the suffocating chains of blood. He wasn't alone. Illy stood to his right, hands trembling but eyes locked forward. Amos, the youngest, clutched a backpack of essentials: food, water, a torn map they had found in an old book under the floorboards. Their mother, Cora, hadn't stopped them. She hadn't said a word. When Micah whispered the night before that they were leaving, she simply looked at him, nodded, and placed a small silver cross in his hand. "Not for religion," she said, "for remembrance. Remember who you are and who you are not." Micah hadn't slept. The night was filled with sounds: crickets, the occasional howl of a distant coyote, and the haunting echo of his father's boots pacing the porch. Luther always knew something was brewing, even when no one spoke it out loud. And that morning, when the sun finally cracked open the night sky, Micah knew it was now or never. The escape the boys didn't run, they walked, quiet, focused. Every step was calculated. The mountain had ears and Luther had instincts like a predator. The path they followed was one they had secretly mapped for months through a creek that erased footprints, under brambles that tore at their clothes but protected them from being seen. Micah knew this wasn't just a physical escape. It was spiritual, emotional. They weren't just fleeing a place, they were shedding an identity they never chose. They were sons of a man who broke the laws of nature, who chained love with manipulation, who warped the sacred bonds of family into something grotesque. Micah remembered one day years ago when he asked his father what freedom meant. Luther had laughed. Freedom ain't no such thing. You're born where you're born. Blood don't lie. But Micah knew now that blood can lie, blood can carry shame, blood can imprison, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from the very thing that gave them life. Their journey was a test of willpower. Hunger gnawed at them, feet blistered. Illy had to stop several times, gasping for breath, but Micah pushed forward. Every mile away from the cabin felt like a rebirth. Every sound of the woods that once haunted him now felt like freedom's song. On the third night, they stumbled across a gravel road, the first sign of civilization in miles. A passing truck slowed, the driver eyeing them cautiously. "You boys lost." Micah stepped forward. "No, sir, we're trying to get somewhere better." That man, a retired schoolteacher named Carl, didn't ask too many questions. He saw something in their eyes, something he recognized from the faces of kids he'd once taught. Trauma, quiet strength, and a hunger for something more. He drove them to the nearest town, bought them food, helped them contact child services. That was the first time Micah said it out loud. "My father is my mother's brother. We didn't know at first, but we know now." The breaking of chains, Child Protection Services placed them in a temporary shelter. They were interviewed, counseled, and offered education for the first time. The story shook the town, but it didn't define the boys, it freed them. For the first time, Micah looked in a mirror and didn't see shame. He saw resilience. He didn't hate his parents, not even Luther. Hate would only chain him again, but he also didn't excuse what happened. He faced it, named it, and walked beyond it. Micah realized something powerful. You are not what you come from. You are what you choose to become. He and his brothers stayed close. Illy took to drawing his sketches of the mountains, their cabin, and the road they walked became local exhibits in a healing art therapy program. Amos eventually spoke publicly about their story, giving hope to others who'd come from similar dark places. Micah went to school, then college, and later became a counselor helping teens untangle themselves from generational trauma, cycles of abuse, and the lies that blood sometimes tells. He often told his students, "Your legacy starts the moment you say, 'This ends with me.'" The real meaning of family. Micah and his brothers rebuilt their lives, but they never denied their past. It became the soil from which their strength grew. They created their own definition of family, one not built on biology, but on trust, healing, and truth. Escaping the chains of blood didn't mean erasing their story. It meant transforming it, turning pain into purpose, scars into symbols of survival. Micah once wrote in his journal, "I am not the son of sin. I am the child of choice, the choice to be free." And that choice changed everything. Micah had spent years outrunning the shadow of his father. Every step away from that mountain cabin had felt like peeling off the skin of a life he never chose. He had found peace, built a new name for himself, and helped others break free from the chains of their own traumas. But there was one chapter he hadn't closed. Luther, his father, his uncle, the man who shattered every boundary, yet lived as if he had broken none. For years, Micah avoided thinking about him. The courts had done their work. Luther had been arrested after a local investigation spurred by Micah and his brother's testimony. Charges were filed. But in the end, because of the remote nature of their upbringing and the lack of concrete documentation, Luther got off with minimal punishment, probation, counseling, and court mandated separation from his sons. To Micah, it didn't feel like justice, but time had passed. The world moved on, and deep within Micah, something began to stir. Not anger, not hatred, but a need for resolution. Not to forgive, not to excuse, But to face the letter, it started with a letter. Micah had written it a dozen times over the years, but never sent it. This time he did. Luther, I don't write to reconcile, I write to confront. I want to see you man to man, not as a boy trapped in a lie, not as a child in chains, but as the man I've become, the one you never expected and never broke. If you're willing to talk, I'll be at the old church where Mama used to pray. 1 month from today, come if you're not afraid of the truth. He sent it. No response came. Micah didn't expect one. But 1 month later, he sat on the wooden pew of the abandoned mountain church, cracked windows letting in the light like silent blessings. Time seemed to stretch. His brothers had offered to come. He told them no. This was his burden to lay down, and then the door creaked. Luther stepped in, older, smaller, weathered by age, maybe guilt. Maybe just life. Micah didn't move. Luther walked slowly, as if expecting to be struck by lightning in that sacred place. You really came? Micah said. Luther nodded. I had to see for myself what kind of man my son became. The confrontation. Micah didn't waste time. You raised us in a lie, he said. You crossed lines that should never be crossed. Luther sat down, staring at the wooden floor. It was all I knew. He muttered. We didn't have no one teaching us right from wrong. I loved your mother, my sister, yes, but we didn't mean to hurt nobody. Micah's voice didn't rise. It was cold, clear, steady. You didn't mean to. You built a prison out of family. You locked us in with shame and called it love. Luther looked at him, eyes hollow. I never touched you boys wrong. I fed you, protected you. No, Micah snapped. You protected yourself. You didn't want the world to see what you were, so you kept us hidden, afraid, taught us lies and called them facts. Silence hung between them. I can't undo it. Luther finally whispered. I know, Micah said. That's not why I came. Then why? Micah took a breath. To tell you that I'm not you, and I never will be. The power of not becoming. Micah had thought of this moment for years. He thought it would feel like war, like fire and fury, but it didn't. It felt like freedom. He wasn't there to make Luther apologize. Some men never change, some wounds never close, but confronting him wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming Micah's own story. You still don't understand what you did, Micah said quietly, and maybe you never will, but I do, and I won't pass it on. He stood up. You gave me life, but you also gave me pain. I've turned that pain into purpose. I've helped boys who were broken like I was. I've stopped the cycle, the one you swore was unbreakable. Luther didn't respond. His hands trembled on his knees. Micah walked to the door. He paused, looked back once. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. And then he walked out, sunlight flooding over him like grace. The final step. Micah never saw his father again. Luther faded into the corners of the mountains, a ghost of a past that no longer held chains over his sons. When news came years later of Luther's death, Micah felt only stillness. No hate, no joy, just release. He returned to the church once more, this time with Eli and Amos. They stood together, no longer boys of a broken bloodline, but men of a new legacy. Micah placed the same silver cross his mother had given him on the altar. This, he said, is where the cycle ended. And from that day forward, nothing that came before could define them again. Micah stood at the edge of the old mountain clearing, where wildflowers now grew in the shadow of the ruins that once held his family in darkness. The cabin was gone, torn down years ago by the state after Luther's death. It had rotted into the ground like the secrets it once sheltered. Only a few beams and scattered stones remained, overgrown by nature, as if the earth itself had decided to erase what was never meant to be written. But Micah had returned, not to grieve the past, but to honor what had come from it, a legacy redeemed. The burden of a name for years, the name Colton, was a stain whispered with judgment in schoolyards, murmured with disgust in churches, or printed on legal files with the weight of scandal. Born from incest and isolation, Micah and his brothers Eli and Amos were never supposed to have a future. Society expected them to fall into crime, addiction, or despair, but Micah refused. He had once heard a preacher say, "The blood that flows through you doesn't define you, the choices you make do." Those words lodged in his soul like a spark, and he clung to them through every sleepless night, every shame-filled memory, every time someone looked at him and saw not a man, but a mistake. He didn't just want to outrun his past, he wanted to rewrite it. Building what was never given, Micah started small with himself. He got clean, stayed in school, worked 2 jobs and studied late into the night. While others partied or gave in to pressure, Micah kept his eyes on something no one else could see: redemption. He became a social worker, not for the paycheck that was never much, but for the mission, for every child lost in a system they didn't ask for every boy who felt like a curse in his own skin, for every girl told she was worthless because of where she came from. Micah walked into broken homes and said what no one had said to him as a child: "You matter. You can break this. You are not doomed to repeat what hurt you." His name was still Colton, but it no longer carried shame. Now it carried strength. When people heard his story, the full, unflinching truth, they didn't look away in pity. They leaned in with respect, because he wasn't a survivor anymore. He was a redeemer. The family they chose to be became a counselor, Amos a carpenter. Together, the 3 brothers rebuilt more than their own lives. They built a community center in the very county that once branded them as unclean. They called it the Renewal House, a safe place, a refuge, a symbol of how even the most twisted roots could grow into something beautiful. Kids from foster care found a home there. Single mothers found support. Addicts found a second chance, and on the wall behind the front desk were carved words that Micah had lived by. Pain may write your beginning, but hope will finish your story. It wasn't perfect. Trauma doesn't just disappear. But every day they chipped away at the curse that once held them down, and every child they saved was one less tragedy in a long line of forgotten names. Facing the mirror without shame, Micah still had scars. He still had nights where he woke up in cold sweat, memories flooding back like ghosts, but he no longer feared the mirror. He looked into it and saw not his father's eyes or his mother's silence. He saw himself a man who stared into the abyss and didn't fall in. A man who broke a generational chain, a man who walked out of fire carrying others with him. His greatest accomplishment wasn't escaping, it was returning, not to stay, but to transform. Redemption isn't just survival, it's creation. People often asked Micah how he did it, how he overcame what he came from. He always said the same thing: "I stopped asking why me, and started asking what now." He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to create new beginnings for others. In the final years of his life, Micah wrote a memoir called Born in the Dark, A Journey to Light. It became a guide for foster youth, abuse survivors, and social workers across the nation. Not a tale of tragedy, but of triumph. And when he passed, they didn't whisper about who his parents were. They shouted about what he became. From curse to calling, the Colton legacy had once been a night where no one dared to speak. Now it was a testimony people drew strength from, because Micah proved that the worst of beginnings don't guarantee the worst of endings. He turned horror into healing, wounds into wisdom, blood into blessing. He showed the world that what you come from doesn't decide what you create. That's how legacies are redeemed, not with denial, but with courage, with truth, and with the audacity to become more than anyone thought you could be. This story is not told to provoke shock, but to remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Some people are born into darkness, ignorance, trauma, generational sin, but they still choose light. Micah Ballard's journey teaches us that you are not your parents' mistakes, and your legacy begins with your decisions. Even the most inbred Patriarch of Appalachia couldn't stop a boy from becoming a man, and a man from becoming a light to others.